Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to moderate this session. And let's get right to the opening remarks, which will be delivered by the current CIRCA director, Dr. Glenn B. Gregorio, who is a professor at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños at the College of Agriculture. He is also an academician of the Philippine National Academy of Science and Technology. And lastly, recently, he was appointed a 2021 UN Food Systems Champion. I call on Dr. Gregorio.
Thank you, Bimbo, and good afternoon to everyone. And thank you for joining this plenary session 3. CIRCA is hosting this session of the Philippine Economic Society's 60th annual meeting and conference to discuss major challenges in development economics in line with the disruption that have emerged during the pandemic. Moreover, this session resonates with CIRCA's 11 5-year plan of accelerating transformation through agricultural innovation, or we call it ATTAIN, as we strive to contribute to the SDG number 1, or no poverty, to end poverty in all its form. This session on Proof for Development Policies includes notable economists as panelists. Most of them I know, namely Dr. K. Ochoa. Of course, he is of Kobe University, who is also a CIRCA Senior Fellow and member of CIRCA's Publication Board. Actually, I could not forget K because he's the one, during my younger years at Erie, he's the one who sent me to Africa. Maybe I was misbehaving then. That's why he sent me to Africa to be a rice breeder for Africa in sub-Saharan Africa during the time. So I behaved a little bit. After 5 years, he asked me to come back, and now I'm with CIRCA. And also we have, of course, Mark. I know Mark Rosengrant of the IPRI. I visited him once, maybe that was 2010, long time ago. And the advisory board of Asian Journal of Agriculture and Development, published also by CIRCA. Dr. Sutad Setbonrang, a former board of trustees of the International Rice Research Institute, which is also very near my heart. My first job, which I was there for 29 years, where I developed my career. Dr. Peter War, who is from the Australian National University and will be visiting CIRCA tomorrow and give a talk at CIRCA and the UPLB community. I'm excited to announce that this session, anytime we will just be formally launch the book entitled Proof for Development Policies, Lessons from the Philippines and East Asia, that is dedicated to the Socio-Economic Planning Secretary, Dr. Secretary Arsenio M. Balisacan, which we have soft launched secretly last night, who is also a former CIRCA director, having served our center from 2003 to 2009 for 6 years. CIRCA is proud to play a significant role in the joint publication of this book with Singapore-based Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Yusof Ishak Institute, or ICIAS. Later this session, the book's 3 editors, Dr. Hal Hill of Australian National University, Dr. Maha of the Ateneo de Manila University, and former CIRCA staff. I think all of us here are former CIRCA staff. And Dr. James Romaset of the University of Hawaii will be presenting the book, whose chapter authors, contributors, including eminent economists and other experts in their respective field. CIRCA joins the authors, editors, and ICIAS in recommending this book to policymakers, researchers, government executives, professionals, working in agriculture and rural development to aid decision-making. The co-publication of this book also marks the renewal of the collaboration between ICS and CIRCA, which have produced 5 books together in 2007 to 2011 during Secretary Balisacan's tenure as CIRCA director. We consider this renewal partnership with ICS as important part of CIRCA's 56th anniversary celebration this month. Once again, CIRCA is very pleased to be part of this milestone of PES conference, and we wish everyone a fruitful discussion towards better, bigger, and smarter solution for a more dynamic, inclusive, and sustainable developed economy and proper world. Mabuhay. God bless us all. Good afternoon.
Thank you for that message, Dr. Gregorio. Now to introduce the book itself is one of the book's editors, Dr. Hal Hill, who is an H.W. Arendt Professor Emeritus of Southeast Asian Economics at the Australian National University. I believe he is joining us through Zoom.
Yes, Bimbo, good afternoon.
Yes, good afternoon,
Can
Hal.
you hear me okay?
Go ahead, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
That's good. So I'm tuning in from the side of a country highway in Australia. So thanks to the marvels of modern telecommunications, I got this opportunity just to say a few words briefly. Thank you very much and good afternoon to everybody, including to Dr. Gregorio, and thank you for your support, Glenn, for CIRCA, and hello to my distinguished panelists as well. So I've got, I think, just a few minutes, and it's to just briefly talk about the book. Some of it I said last night at the secret launch. Let me just repeat a few of the words which I said. By the way, can you tell me, please, is Secretary Balisacan in the audience?
Unfortunately, not yet.
Okay, but at least I wished him happy 65th birthday last night. So let me just repeat it for the record. The book is a Festschrift in honor of Secretary Balisacan, and as I mentioned last night, although he's turning 65, I'm sure it doesn't signal the end of his working life. I'm sorry I can't be with you personally also on this auspicious occasion. So as Dr. Maha and Professor Jim Romerset can tell us, this project was launched in 2018 on the sidelines of the PES conference of that year, with the impending 65th birthday of RC. We thought we should get moving. And the book has turned out, I think, to be an excellent piece of scholarship, pro-poor development policies, essays in honor of Arsenio Balisacan. As Festschrifts go, this is a very big one. It's, in fact, more than 800 pages, and it could have been more, except the editors, Maha, Jim, and myself, thought we better press the pause button at 800 pages. It has 25 chapters and no fewer than 46 contributors from leading scholars all around the world, some of whom, of course, at the conference, and some of whom will be speaking at this very panel. The book also has forwards by two giants in the field, Professor Sieghart and Professor Timmer, and a very nice back cover endorsement from Professor Anne Kruger. So let me just say that the book really arose from the exceptionally high regard for Arsenio Balisacan, for his rigorous academic work, for his commitment to good public policy at the highest level of government across, I think, 5 presidencies, for his leadership in so many domains, and for his nurturing of younger scholars and government officials, and perhaps most important of all, for being such a decent and pleasant human being. Like the other 2 co-editors and like almost all of the contributors, I've had the pleasure of interacting with RC. We co-edited 2 major book volumes together, and he was instrumental in another book volume, which I played a role with Mani Esquerra and Monching as well. And so he's had a big impact on my life. I've had the opportunity to work closely with RC and to learn a lot from him about agriculture, about poverty, about competition policy more recently, and about the Philippines, and more generally about major global development issues. So I won't try and summarize a book of 800 pages with 25 chapters. I just want to draw out one particular issue, which I think is relevant. I hope it will be of interest to the audience. And that actually is, to quote the words of Professor Jerry Sickert in another context, it was the gentle conspiracy, quote unquote, to engage RC with the volume. And that manifested itself in chapter 2, which is an interpretive essay on the Philippine economy. It drew on some earlier work that RC and I did, and quite a few illuminating Zoom conversations in 2020 and 2021, where we discussed a lot of issues, also with RC's able young staff member, Russell. And I want to draw out what I think are the two perhaps key conclusions from this chapter, which I think permeate through the book as well. The first one, I think, is a rather optimistic one, and that is the Philippines, which had, as we know, a really tough 1980s decade with deep economic and political crises. The fact that it grew out of those crises and reformed on the basis of the very difficult lessons learned during the crises, and reformed for the better, and the better obviously in politically, in the restoration of democracy, in key areas of economic policy, particularly establishing much stronger macroeconomic economic management, reversing the earlier drifting trade policy, inward-looking trade orientation, and quite a lot of other reform. And that reform, these reforms, which took, of course, some time, especially in the democratic era, reform is rarely quick. These reforms actually had a major dividend in terms of stronger economic performance, and relevant to the title of the book, falling poverty incidence in the Philippines. So for the 20 years or so prior to the COVID pandemic, Philippine economy was performing on a level comparable with its dynamic Southeast Asian neighbors, something which it hadn't been achieved for at least the previous 20 years. So it's I draw from that a fairly optimistic conclusion that gradually reform has occurred. It's been important reform, and it's had a dividend in not just faster economic growth for that period up till 2019, but also in much improved living standards. Now, the second conclusion, which I wanted to draw attention to, is, as we know, the COVID pandemic hit the Philippines very hard. In 2020, its GDP contraction was one of the largest in Southeast Asia, in fact, in the world. So it was hit very hard, and it exposed vulnerabilities in the health system, in the social security fabric, and other areas. And so this is obviously a period of reconstruction from that very difficult 2 years, 2020, 2021. So to connect the two general conclusions I'm drawing, I guess I would therefore want to draw an optimistic conclusion for the second concerning development, and that is that since the Philippines has previously learnt from these difficult episodes and reformed, I guess one has to plausibly argue that we can be optimistic moving forward on the basis of this learnt experience, especially since Secretary Balisacan, bless his soul, is now back in the engine room of economic policy making at the highest level. So one has to, I think, have a sense of optimism. Yeah, they're the main things I want to draw attention to in the book. I do want to take this opportunity of thanking all the people concerned with this volume. As I say, I think it's an exceptionally high quality volume. It was a pleasure to co-edit. I want to thank my co-editors, Maha, who of course ran the show, and Jim and I dutifully obeyed Maha's Maha's instructions, and they're always very timely and very useful. I want to thank the many people who assisted with the publication of the volume. That, of course, includes Serica and Dr. Glenn and the publishers. ICS Singapore, always a pleasure to deal with. We had tremendous editorial support, Lily and others. I want to thank them very much. And most important, I guess, we've got to thank the contributors, since when you're editing a volume, you never quite know what to expect in advance, and you have to sometimes deal with sort of, difficult cases of papers which aren't up to par. Well, I can confidently say, and it's a remarkable statement, that in the 25 chapters, we didn't have that problem. All the chapters, we went through a pretty careful editing and sifting process, and all of the chapters measured up easily. And that, of course, reflects the admiration and very high regard for RC. People really wanted to contribute. So thank you very much, Bimbo, and I'm sorry I'm not there. Hi to all my friends in the Philippines. Hope to get back soon, and all the best to everybody. Thanks very much, and goodbye from a highway in Australia. Thanks very much. Goodbye.
Al, take a look at your screen. I had them face the camera to the audience, so everyone wave to Hal, please. Hi, Hal.
Thank you very much, and looking forward to being back in Manila soon. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. All right, let's move on to the main event. We actually have 4 of the contributors of the book as panelists for you this afternoon. As I call you, you can join me here up. First is Dr. Keijiro Otsuka, who is from Kobe University. We have Mark Rosegrant from the International Food Policy Rice Institute, or IFRI. We have Sutad Seth Bunsarng, who is from the board of IRI and the Bank of Thailand. And Peter War from Australian National University. Please give our panelists a round of applause.
Hello, everybody. I'm Kei Otsuka from Japan. I'm supposed to use PowerPoint slides. I'm a contributor to Chapter 6, entitled Changing Relationship Between Farm Size and Productivity, its implication for Philippine agriculture. Next, please. Next, please. Yeah, roughly 30 years ago, I said no controversy in the history of agricultural economics is more perennial than the inefficiency of shared tenancy. Mahamanga has contributed, Jim Rumaset contributed, Peter Wu also contributed. I added my own ideas, and I published a review article. And I resolved the first issue in my Journal of Economic Literature paper in 1992. I almost took a copy and paste of the first statement. Then I said this time in the Festschrift book in honor of Professor Balisakan, no controversy in the history of agricultural economics more perennial than the relationship between farm size and productivity. Almost the same with a little bit of modification. The purpose of my current paper is to end the second controversy. Next, please. Many economists like Gershon Feder and Michael Lipton believe in the inverse relationship between farm size and productivity. Notably in India, small ones are more efficient than large ones. There are also many other economists who believe that large farms are more efficient than small farms. So purposes of my presentation is to identify causes of different relationship between farm size and productivity based on a careful literature review. And then I want to draw policy implication of changing relationship between farm size and productivity for the future of Philippine agriculture. Economics of farm size productivity relationship. Major contributor was Gershon Feder in 1985. He said, since large farms have to employ more hired workers, hired workers do not work hard as much as employer wants, or they shock. Therefore, yield is lower on large farms than small farms, leading to IR, inverse relationship between farm size and productivity. And my advisor, Hayami, and myself argue that labor markets in care-intensive activities never work efficiently in spatially dispersed, ecologically diverse agricultural production environment because of the high monitoring cost of higher labor. Therefore, family labor is used in such care-intensive activities as land preparation, water control, fertilizer application. Hired workers, on the other hand, are employed only in such simple activities as weeding, transplanting, and harvesting. Next, please. Okay, and then mechanization, which has been taking place widely in Asia now, reduces the demand for family labor. Tractorization in particular reduces the need for family labor for land preparation. Also, supervision of hired workers in mechanized tasks is not so difficult. I met one owner of a large farm in Brazil. He operates 500,000 hectares. I asked him, is it difficult to manage workers? He said, no, not at all. By using GIS and computer, etc., supervision cost is very small. Therefore, advantage of, I'm reading the section, since my English is not as good as you may wish, so I typed all the things that I'm speaking in the second bullet point. Thus, advantage of small farm declines because of the mechanization. And disadvantage of large farms also declines with mechanization, weakening the inverse relationship. Furthermore, mechanization leads to scale economies or increase the optimum farm size. That leads to the emergence of positive relationship between farm size and productivity in high-income countries. Next, please. According to the recent meta-analysis of Europeans, strong inverse relationship tends to be found still when gross value of output per hectare or yield per hectare is used. And many studies, I'm now in the second bullet point, including my own, found that weakening tendency of inverse relation is observed in several Asian countries where mechanization has been taking place. India, Vietnam, I don't see much papers in this country, in Indonesia to some extent. And in Japan, US, and Australia, there are several studies which found positive relationship between farm size and productivity. And also, interestingly, there are several studies in China, Brazil, and Pakistan, which found U-shaped relationship between farm size and productivity. So on the small scale, the productivity is high, but as farm size increases, productivity declines, and then finally productivity increases. Again, it's a little bit confusing. Let's see. This graph shows a typical case. Typically, particularly in South Asia, the relationship between farm size and gross value of production or yield per hectare tends to be negative. If we look at the profit or net value, the relationship is less clear. But because of the intensive use of family labor on small land, on small farms, the yield tends to be higher. And on the other hand, in some countries, traditional labor-intensive farming system and large-scale capital-intensive large-scale capital-intensive production system. Can you go back? Large-scale capital-intensive mechanized system coexist. If that happens, we tend to observe inverse relationship between farm productivity and farm size. So to summarize, next page, please. So if a traditional labor-intensive farming system prevails, we tend to observe inverse relationship between farm size and productivity. If capital-intensive mechanized particularly large-scale mechanized farming system prevails, like in the United States or Australia, we tend to observe positive relationship between farm size and productivity. If labor-intensive and capital-intensive farming system coexist, like in China, we tend to find U-shaped relationship between farm size and productivity. The relationship between farm size and productivity in Asian countries is moving from inverse relation prevailed much earlier, moving from inverse relation to U-shaped relation or even positive relationships. So in order to reap the benefits of increasing advantage of large farms in Asia, farm size expansion must take place. And large-scale mechanization must also take place. But the reality is farm size in Asia has been declining, particularly in this country. Compared with the 20, 30 years ago, average farm size has become 1/2. This is an interesting figure, which is from Central Luzon survey, which has been conducted since 1966, more or less every 4 years. If you look at the blue line, care-intensive activities by family labor. So family labor was very important for care-intensive activities, particularly land preparation. But the importance of family labor has been declining because of the tractorization or mechanization. So that means advantage of small farms has been lost. On the other hand, advantage of large farms has been increasing, particularly because the amount of higher labor has declined, particularly from 2012 to 14. There was an introduction of combined harvesters, and the employment higher labor declined so sharply. So in my final slide, I'd like to strongly argue that there is a strong need for redesigning land reform in the Philippines. First bullet point. Okay. Fundamental problem is that the land reform program suppresses land tenancy transactions, suppresses land market transactions, thereby preventing efficient transfer of land from inefficient to efficient farmers. That was discussed by Professor Faberia. He might have gone. Also, Jim discussed about this. Setting a ceiling of land holding is detrimental to the efficiency of land allocation, particularly when positive relationship emerges between farm size and productivity. I believe that is the case in the Philippines. The positive relation is now emerging in Philippine agriculture. Since CAP, Comprehensive Agricultural Reform Program, failed to generate an effective land rental market system or transaction, particularly because of the land ceiling. Land is inefficiently allocated even at present, as argued by Mishra and Shivri. So in the face of changing relationship between farm size and productivity, it is now critically important for the Philippine government to recognize the role of land rental market and to shift from anti-land market policy with land ceiling to pro-land market policy without land ceiling. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
It's gonna work. Okay, thank you. I'm glad to be here to talk to all of you today. In my chapter in the book, which is actually our chapter, I wrote it together with Mercy Sombilia, who is, of course, now the Undersecretary for Policy in the Department of Agriculture, and was with NETA at the time that we prepared the paper. We focused on the impact of climate change on agriculture in the Philippines, and started out by looking at the cost of climate change on the overall economy using an economy-wide CGE model, and found that climate change, just figuring that climate change directly on the agriculture sector would cost about 150 billion pesos per year through 2050, together with causing substantial increases in hunger and malnutrition. Rather than focusing on the modeling that was involved there, though, what I want to talk about today is how we felt that the Philippines could deal with climate change. So climate change adaptation and mitigation, and really the overall development of the agriculture sector, requires policies and investments to modernize and strengthen the competitiveness of the rice sector, which is well behind other countries in Southeast Asia in terms of productivity and efficiency. It also then requires crop diversification, including shifts from production of rice to higher valued crops, and as well as diversification to higher, more nutritious diets in order to become more climate resilient. Some of the key initiatives, and of course, I don't have time to go into detail on these, but I'll run through a number of things that we felt would be cost effective in pushing this transformation of the agricultural sector. First, there needs to be an additional increases in agriculture research and development and seed systems to improve productivity and to reduce labor and input costs, which again are substantially higher here than, for example, in Vietnam and Thailand. On the margin, these investments should be directed to traits that are needed to combat climate change impacts, including heat and drought tolerance, as well as pest resistance, which also then helps in increasing productivity in response to these kinds of impacts. To the extent that there are market failures or negative externalities in current production systems, we should support modern climate smart agricultural technologies and crop management to enhance sustainability. But again, the first big step in this is there has to be a big reduction in the existing regime of broad subsidies in the agriculture sector. For example, subsidies to water and fertilizer, which cause substantial overuse of these, environmental damage, and additional greenhouse gas emissions. So while shifting from those broad subsidies, of course, that can cause substantial problems for farmers in the transition stage. So we recommend an increase in the decoupled payments for income support for farmers during this transition phase. This is already provided for in the rice tarification law, and we believe that it should be expanded to compensate for reduced distortionary subsidies and quotas. There also needs to be a change in investment and policies in the irrigation and water management sector. We heard about water management earlier today. And in addition to seeking increased productivity for rice in these sectors in irrigation, we need to enable diversified cropping in irrigation systems, which is very low levels currently in the Philippines. This requires a shift on the margin away from investing in new irrigation systems to modernizing existing irrigation systems to support non-rice irrigation and diversification of the economy. This would include not just sort of physical investments such as canal lining or land leveling, but substantial investments over time in application of information technology, remote sensing, and databases to support water monitoring and counting in real time. Weather index-based crop insurance should also be experimented with at a greater level and pushed as a more efficient way of covering the risks of climate and weather, which are so prevalent here, compared to the all hazard insurance that is mainly utilized here now. then we just heard from Kay that there's an emerging economies of scale in agriculture here in the Philippines. So to achieve these economies of scale, in addition to the issues on land reform, there needs to be work for consolidation of land through various kinds of land management policies, such as block farming, joint farming, and contract farming to achieve these economies of scale. As we increase the management size of these farms, you can also start developing a countervailing power to the current market power in the wholesale sectors of the rice economy here. So we need to get farmers to be able to bargain more effectively by increasing the size of operations. This does not necessarily mean requiring farmers to sell land to bigger units, but rather ways through block farming or others to consolidate the management size rather than necessarily changing ownership size. Value chain development is one of the other areas where the Philippines is behind comparable countries in Southeast Asia. So there needs to be substantial investment, as we've heard from others also, in the rural sector to reduce post-harvest losses and reduce marketing margins that are hammering farmers right now, and to move towards, again, and with co-financing and public-private partnerships that we've heard about, to move towards promoting value-added activities such as processing rather than farmers and cooperatives only selling the raw commodities. These will be should be supported by investments in rural infrastructure, particularly rural roads and bridges, as well as mobile networks to push the information and communications technology that farmers need to have access to, again, to help sustain their position in the value chains. Finally, it's essential as all these transitions take place, is a need that we've also heard some from this morning to enhance social protection and gender policy and to empower women and lower income farmers during this dynamic period of change. There should be increased support for social support programs, including a faster expansion of the 4 Ps program to rural areas and more efficient use, for example, of emergency cash transfer programs that could be provided on a timely and coordinated and transparent basis to rural communities in order to mitigate the effect of climate shocks as well. The Philippine government already has a number of programs in this area, including various types of social safety nets, but there needs to be a substantial improvement in the coordination and efficiency of use of these programs to protect farmers and those in the rural sector during a very dynamic transformation of the agriculture sector that's going to be needed to help push the Philippine pro-poor development further. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So this is the book that will be launched later. It's very thick, so it's worth all the money that you have to pay. I'm not going to tell you what I have written. You have to buy this book in order to know what is in there. I just tell you the gist, what is in chapter 24, which is toward the end of the book. And you have to go through all those 23 chapters before you reach these particular important chapters. When we planned this book, I was a member of the board of trustees. And then I became the chairman of the board of trustees. And then I left the position already when this book is launched. So it's a long time. So many of the facts may have changed. So I apologize for that. But still, the worth of the paper is not only in those historical data. I start off this particular article looking at the global rice market. And I conclude by giving some suggestion of what should be done in the rice market going forward in the future. I think I have 10 minutes to do that. The international rice market has been changing and undergo a very important transitions. And the process is continuing, and we have to really look at this closely, because if you notice, most of the paper that talk about agriculture make reference to rice. In fact, agriculture is much bigger than just rice. But rice certainly play a very important role in the agriculture sectors in the Philippines and in Asia. Rice production has been increasing throughout these 2-3 decades. An average growth of about total output of 1 to 2% on the average per year. So in fact, we have enough rice to consume. At this moment, we have the highest level of rice stock in the world. We can last up to 6 months if you look at the total stock. So rice market has been quite successful. The problem is, even with this increase in production, there are malnutrition. There are people that are still starving, doesn't have enough rice to eat around the world. The question then is that to get food security is beyond production. There are many other factors that we have to marry in, and that's the role and responsibility of all the stakeholders that are involved. 3 very important phenomenon on the supply side, aside from the fact that we have the highest stock of rice in the world at the moment, is most of the stock of rice actually are in China. It's 90% of the stock is in China. Because China actually is the world's largest producer also, so that is not a lot for them. Second largest, of course, is in India. But anyway, that define very much what is happening in the world. So if these 2 big economies, India and China, increase their production, then it saturated the world market of rice. Yield has been increasing, despite the fact that rice is relatively lower price compared to other grains like wheat, corn, soybean. What is happening? This is a result of direct government subsidy in the production side that prevent the price of rice for the consumer to increase. You give direct money to the farmers. Are we going to continue doing this? That's a good question. At the same time, one big meta modernization is happening in the 2 other components of the market. On the demand side, most of the consumer of rice right now, or majority of the rice consumer, are in the urban area, not in the rural areas. So that is a major change. And this trend will continue going forward in the future. More people will be leaving rice production. More farmers will be leaving rice production. They'll go into the urban area and become the consumer. So that's one important trend. The second phenomenon on the demand side is these people become middle income class also. Normally, you move into the city, find more job, and if you graduate, you become a middle income class. In the urban environment, the market environment changed completely, right? Because you do not go to the store your rice in a barn and then eat it. You go and store your rice in the retail shop. And that's where you get your rice stock. So the market environment have changed. The other characteristic that have changed is the demand for the quality aspect of rice has increased as income increased. I was with the ERI driver one day, and he told me that he will not eat low quality rice because it's even though he's middle income, lower middle income class people, because his low quality rice is not suitable for his children and wife. So the concern is not himself, but the next generation of people. They want better health, better food for them. The rice market have changed, has been transformed at the farm level also. Now you have better access to the market. You have more information. Really have to? Okay. Well, so I think these are some of the key changes. Modernization of the farm at the farm level, at the consumer level. The major driver of the change came from urbanization, middle income class increase. But going forward, digitization is going to change the pattern of consumption also. Many of us in this room probably order their rice through internet. And in fact, you order from the internet, it's probably cheaper than buying from the store and the retail store next to you. Going forward, rice is one of the most polluted crop in terms of emission of the greenhouse gas, right? As we know it. There will be modification of the planting method that are required. So aside from these changes I mentioned, there are other parameters that actually it will be a big challenge for rice. We heard in the previous session about environmental requirement. If you just look at rice, rice grown in different countries has different level of carbon emission because the planting methods are different. So what kind of incentive structure do we have to design for the rice? If we design the incentive structure that fit Japan, it will not fit here. How do we then calculate a total emission from rice? What are the criteria? How do we do that? Food security is a big challenge going forward. How do we address that? The proposal is let the government play less role because the self-sufficient policy that has been pursued by the government actually is backfiring. There are a lot of room that the government is overdoing quite a lot of things, and maybe the private sector should play more roles, both in the provisions, marketing, and also in provision for the poor. The role of the private sector should increase. The question then, what should be the role of the government? The public sector should also should have their role. But I think at the moment, it is not very clear what the government is trying to do. Are they overdoing it? I think the public sector should implement one very important management requirement, which is good governance. If you look at what the good government, some of the basic principles should be adopted. For example, accountability, responsibility, transparency. If you look at what is happening in the rice policy in most countries, they do not meet this very basic good management or good governance requirement. The government designed the policy, implementing it, and assess it themselves. So it's going to be difficult to find, something that is going wrong there. So there'll be more check and balance in that. Rice research should be expanded because, as I said, agriculture is not only rice. You have to then look at something that is broader. And we have a lot of programs now at IRI trying to look at the farming system which go beyond rice. During the past few months, the world is confronting a new challenge, which is the food security. And deep inside there, in fact, a huge problem that the war has created is not just the supply disruption, but the trust that country have for each other. Rice survive on trade. I mean, importing of rice is very important. But right now, because of the failure of the trust that we have from supply of rice from other countries, every country is now trying to increase the production of rice. Is that the acceptable situation? Or how do we address that? I feel that, in fact, if the private sector can play more role in doing this, then I think we can arrive at the objective of food security or rice security in a much more efficient manner. Digitization is upon us. Rice sectors, modernization of the production side, the smart farming is taking on actually the ASEAN Agricultural Minister just approved a program for for digitization of the farming sectors. These are some of the things that I feel are important going forward. The rest, the details are rest in this book. So please go and buy it from Bimbo in the front. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm going to be talking about a very big question. What is the source of economic growth in Asia? That's a big question. My starting point is 1957 seminal contribution from Robert Solow, in which he invented the subject of growth accounting. Growth accounting is the distinction between output growth that is due to increasing the quantity of inputs used per head of population and increasing the amount of output that's obtained per unit of those inputs. That's growth accounting. And Solow came up with the astounding result that the first of those things, increasing the quantity of inputs per head of population, accounted for 12.5% of US growth over the years before 1957 when he published this article. And there was an enormous residual left over after accounting for that, which was 87.5% of all US growth. And that residual Solow called technical progress. And then in 1994, Paul Krugman came up with a magnificent article in the magazine Foreign Affairs called The Myth of Asia's Miracle. I recommend this article to everyone. Krugman is a wonderful economist and a superb writer. And in that article, he said, in Asia, the answer is the exact opposite of what Solow said. He was very brave to have said that because he was a former student of Robert Solow at MIT. And he said that in Asia, almost all of the growth that has occurred is due to what he called perspiration. And by perspiration, he meant two things: increasing labor force participation, that is more labor per head of population, that's labor force participation, and adding physical and human capital to raw labor. Those two things he called perspiration. And according to Krugman, when you allow for those two things, there's almost no residual left over. So there's no inspiration to be discussed at all. Everything is perspiration. There is no inspiration. That was Krugman's article. And he concluded from that this form of growth in Asia was unsustainable long-term because of diminishing returns to adding capital to labor, diminishing returns. Well, guess what? Krugman was wrong. He missed something very important because he forgot about agriculture. I'm going to try to convince you of that. Krugman's article was based on some empirical research by others. Krugman did no original empirical research at all for this article. He drew on others, which were primarily based on studies of Singapore and Hong Kong. To a lesser extent, South Korea, but mainly Singapore and Hong Kong, especially Singapore. Well, these two city-states, Singapore and Hong Kong, are not typical of Asia. They have no traditional agricultural sectors. They import essentially all of their food. They're not typical of Asia. So did that affect the kind of conclusions that Krugman drew? And I'm going to say, yes, it really did. I'm going to look at data for Thailand and Indonesia, both of which are far more typical of Asia. Whoa, no, go back one. Yes, stay there, please. Far more typical of Asia than either Singapore or Hong Kong. I haven't done it for the Philippines because I've left that for you guys. So someone here in the audience can do this study for the Philippines. If you do that, please send me a copy. I'm going to say that based on the evidence from Thailand and Indonesia, the movement of people from low productivity agriculture into higher productivity services and industry accounts for a large proportion of the economic growth that has occurred in Thailand and Indonesia. Not Singapore and Hong Kong because they have no agriculture. All right, now skip the next two slides and go to this. Skip the next two. Stop there. I'm going to argue that there are three sources of economic growth that we need to think about in an economy like Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia. The first is what Krugman called perspiration. Growth of factor inputs, that's labor, physical and human capital, relative to population, perspiration. And the second is growth of the productivity of those factors. That's what Krugman calls inspiration through technical change. Now, those two things, A and B, occur in each sector of the economy, within agriculture, within industry, within services. But there's a third. Suppose that the level of productivity is higher in industry and services than it is in agriculture. As people move from agriculture to industry and services, that raises productivity in the economy as a whole. If I need to convince you of that, consider the following thought experiment. Suppose A and B are zero in all sectors. Thought experiment, zero. No productivity growth in agriculture, industry, or services, but that the level of productivity is higher in industry and services than it is in agriculture. Then, if people move from the low productivity to the high productivity sector, productivity in the economy must grow because the size of the high productivity sectors increases. There must be productivity growth in the economy as a whole. There must be economic growth, even though A and B are zero in all sectors. In the paper, I've spelled out a methodology for estimating the size of number C in the slide there. How big is it? If you want to see my methodology, you are going to have to read the paper. Unfortunately, that probably means you have to buy the book. So sorry about that, but here's the answer. For Thailand, movement of people between sectors accounts for 47% of all growth between 1981 and 2017. 47%, almost half. In Indonesia, it accounts for 28% of all growth. Krugman ignored factor C. Please go back one. Right. Krugman ignored C because he was relying on other studies that themselves ignored C because they were talking about Singapore, Hong Kong, to a lesser extent, South Korea, for which low productivity agriculture was unimportant. So that's why in that great article, I still recommend it to you, Krugman never mentions agriculture in the chapter at all. And that's why he got the story about the source of economic growth in Asia wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Kay, Mark, Sutad, and Peter for your succinct presentations. We have time for about 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Does anyone have a question for our esteemed panelists? I saw her raise her hand. Yes, ma'am. I'm not sure where the nearest mic is. There's microphones.
Yes, thank you again. I really want to bring in, I'm Mary Rosales, Ateneo. I want to bring in the people side of this whole discussion, which is all of what you've said is very relevant to people's lives. And I want to show it from the other end because we've been doing work with rural communities on the kind of development, community development side, which includes, of course, production and so on. The thing I think you have to add now to all of what you've said, which are quite valuable, is the younger generation of farmers, not the landless labor, that's another whole sector for agriculture, but at least the farm families and the young people in them. We all know that the hope is that they leave, study, they send study so they can leave and live in the city and get into the higher productivity, hopefully, that was just mentioned, although most of them will wind up in urban slums and living that life in hopes of being more getting into the productive sector. But that's another side. On the side of the IRR, International Institute for Rural Construction, which is based in Cavite, works in the Philippines and some parts of Southeast Asia. I think in their community-based community development, organizing activities with farmers have pretty much found what you said, that if, and with the young people, if they know that they're going to have or already can get access to medium-scale mechanization, right, and farm tools and small-scale tractors, for example, irrigation, credit, and access to some organizing factor, whether it's a cooperative, farmers association, where they have a voice that speaks to local government or whoever is in charge of some of their advantages, then there's an inclination for them to stay. There's an incentive for them to stay. There are 2 reasons I can think of for that. One is many of them now have access to cell phones at least, which means they have tremendous access to a wide range of knowledge, higher levels of expectations or aspirations, even though they're there. And second, they now know, unlike their parents 30 years ago or 20, that if they move to the cities, they're probably going to wind up in slums because that's the only option for them for maybe 80% or 90% of them. So there's a new level of understanding in the younger generation that has to be taken into account. I think the social media access is, of course, one very significant point there. So I'd like to, to comment on that. What are the incentives, given all of this, so that younger people, and that's male and female, because, they're really both involved in farming activities, to stay on the farm rather than wind up in urban slums? Thank you.
Thank you. A response from one of our panelists, Sutad?
Let me take a very quick shot at this. I think what happened right now is a new opportunity arises for redesigning the rural areas. Because in the past, access to the market has been a problem. That's why they have to come to the city. But now the market access, we look at the World Bank has this series, but this topic is called Logistic Productivity Index. I think all the countries now have much better transportation. Philippines is slightly different because you're an island, but you look at what happened in Thailand, in Vietnam, the construction of road is enormous. The question now is, when this opportunity arises, what will happen to the rural sectors? In the past, the rural sector are exporting labors. Now they're importing quite a lot of labors, and they are inventing a lot of new products. Rice is no longer rice. Rice has become not a commodity anymore. It becomes a consumer product. It has packages that you can have available. Any farmers, in fact, can design their own package of rice and sell in the internet at the moment. But of course, some country, this can move faster than the other. So I think, of course, there are a lot of opportunity. And if the strengthening the local community is a key foundation to be built for development going forward.
Okay, actually, I've been told by our organizers that in the interest of time, I actually cannot entertain any more questions. Can we please give our panelists another round of applause? Now, this session was actually supposed to end with a message from Dr. Balisacan himself, but he has sent his regrets. Sorry that he cannot be here because as DEDA Secretary and member of the economic team, he is currently at the Senate plenary deliberations for the national government budget. And it is with a very heavy heart and difficult decision that he cannot be here at the moment. But this is a picture from the book launch last night where the book was actually revealed to him for the first time. He had no idea of the book that these gentlemen and the other contributors had put together. So with that, on behalf of Circa and ISAIAS, the book is actually available for pre-order outside. Just please look for the Circa or ISAIAS booth. It is currently, if I'm not mistaken, 15% off. So we look forward to future collaborations in terms of publications, research, scholarships. Circa is always open to collaborate with those of you who, like us, wish to accelerate transformation through agricultural innovation. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to you all. Oh, I guess they said we're having a photo. Director Glenn, can you join the photo, please? And if anyone had any questions that they wanted to ask, our panelists are just seated in the audience, so you can just approach them. I now turn you back to our hosts.
Thank you very much, Mr. Juliano, and to our speakers, Dr. Glenn Gregorio, Dr. Hal Hill, Dr. Keijiro Otsuka, Dr. Mark Rosegrant, and Dr. Suthad Setbunsarng.
Now we proceed to the next part of our program, a plenary session entitled Philippine Reintegration Efforts for Overseas Workers, Prospects After the Pandemic, sponsored by the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, Philippines. We now give the floor to our moderator for this session, Dr. Alvin Ang of the Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Economics.